Welcome to 5 Barrel Factors, the channel where we break down the 5 key forces shaping global crude oil prices. During week 38 of 2025, Brent crude oil prices recorded a modest but notable increase. The benchmark rose by 1.5% week over week, climbing from $66.7 per barrel to $67.8 per barrel. This uptick reflects ongoing demand pressures and a tighter supply outlook in the global energy market. Here are 5 key factors that influenced crude oil prices over the past week. First, U.S. sanctions on Russian oil, potential for major price impact. The potential for U.S. sanctions on Russian energy exports is one of the most significant factors driving current oil market dynamics. In mid-September, U.S. President Donald Trump threatened to impose major sanctions on Russia, which could drastically alter global oil supply chains. Specifically, Trump has suggested that NATO nations cease purchasing Russian oil and impose tariffs on China. A disruption of around 1.6 million barrels per day of Russian crude could cause Brent crude prices to surge by between $3.50 and $12.75 per barrel. Most European Union countries have largely stopped importing Russian oil, but countries like Hungary and Slovakia still pose challenges to the embargo. With China and India becoming a key buyer of discounted Russian oil, any successful sanctions could significantly tighten global supply and lead to a sharp increase in oil prices. As the EU continues to phase out Russian fossil fuels, global supply risks rise, which likely leads to upward price pressure for Brent and West Texas Intermediate crude in the coming months. Second, EU sanctions on Russian energy, accelerating phase-out of imports. The European Union's ongoing efforts to phase out Russian fossil fuel imports are central to the current volatility in oil prices. The European Commission, led by Ursula von der Leyen, aims to eliminate dependency on Russian energy by 2027, though discussions around accelerating this timeline are heating up. The EU's 19th sanctions package against Russia, still under negotiation, is expected to target energy exports more aggressively. Any speed up in the phase-out, coupled with sanctions on Russian oil, will tighten global supply, thus supporting higher oil prices. According to recent statements, the EU might bring forward the timeline for halting Russian energy imports and address Russia's shadow tanker fleet that bypasses sanctions. The current geopolitical climate, exacerbated by the war in Ukraine, has made energy security a priority for European leaders. Should the EU implement more stringent measures faster than anticipated, the resulting supply squeeze could push global oil prices even higher, especially if Russia's oil exports are constrained further. Third, US interest rate cuts and inflation, impacts on oil demand. Interest rate decisions by the US Federal Reserve are closely tied to global oil price movements. On September 17, 2025, the Fed cut its target interest rate by 25 basis points, from 4.25% to 4.00%, in response to slowing economic growth and rising inflation. While a rate cut typically stimulates economic activity, the accompanying statements from Fed Chairman Jerome Powell emphasized persistent inflation risks. Lower interest rates can increase consumer and business spending, potentially leading to higher demand for oil. However, if inflation remains elevated, oil prices may face upward pressure as well, particularly if increased demand for energy exceeds supply growth. The Fed's mixed signals. Balancing inflation concerns with growth objectives mean that oil prices could experience volatility as market participants adjust to the changing economic landscape. Lower rates may also make oil cheaper for foreign buyers, thus supporting demand, while the prospect of inflationary pressures could lead to increased demand for commodities like oil as hedges. Fourth, U.S. crude exports, a surge in global supply and its impact on prices. The surge in U.S. crude oil exports is one of the key factors currently shaping the global oil market. In the week ending September 12, 2025, U.S. crude exports spiked to 5.28 million barrels per day, the highest level since December 2023. This surge in exports helped to drive U.S. commercial oil inventories down by 9.29 million barrels, bringing them to their lowest level since June 2025. As the U.S. increases its share of global oil supply, other oil-producing regions, particularly in the Middle East and Russia, could see their market share reduced, potentially leading to price fluctuations. Increased exports help to balance global supply and demand, often alleviating any upward price pressure caused by regional supply constraints. However, the rising U.S. exports could also shift global demand dynamics, especially as countries like China and India continue to seek affordable alternatives to expensive Brent crude. These developments could keep oil prices relatively stable, despite ongoing geopolitical tensions. Fifth, Kazakhstan's oil exports, resumption through Azeri pipeline. Kazakhstan has resumed oil exports through Azerbaijan's Baku-Tbilisi-Asayan pipeline, which has the potential to further shift supply in global markets. After nearly 2 months of disruptions caused by contamination issues, Kazakhstan has restarted shipments of crude via the BTC route, which stretches to the Mediterranean. This resumption follows logistical challenges that saw Kazakhstan divert crude exports to Russia. However, the BTC pipeline offers Kazakhstan an alternative route that reduces its reliance on Russian infrastructure. Kazakhstan aims to increase its oil exports through this channel in the future, although current volumes are still relatively modest compared to the Caspian Pipeline Consortium's route through Russia. The resumption of exports could have a limited but significant impact on global oil prices, especially if Kazakhstan manages to increase volumes through BTC. As global oil markets balance between supply and demand, Kazakhstan's additional oil exports could provide further downward pressure on oil prices in regions like Europe and Asia. Thank you for watching 5 Barrel Factors. Stay with us for clear, concise insights into the forces driving global energy markets. Don't forget to subscribe and continue